Hello and welcome to the Rawkode Academy and today's episode of Rawkode Live. I am your host, David Flanagan, although of course you'll know me as Rawkode across the internet. Before we begin on today's session, taking a look at Docker Compose v2, I would encourage you to like, share, comment, subscribe this video, other videos, and the channel, all of the bits in between. This helps other people find the content and makes YouTube's algorithm like me a little bit more. We also have a membership program available at the Academy with an InfluxDB course in flight. Feel free to check out the membership options on rawkode.live. And if you want to come and chat with over 500 other Docker, Kubernetes, cloud native developers and technologists, then come and join us on the Discord at rawkode.chat. All right, housekeeping over. Let's jump over to introduce Bret Fisher, who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give you a little one anyway. Bret Fisher is the author of Docker Mastery and has a really cool channel called Bret Fisher, Docker and DevOps, a channel that I'm sure we've all seen lots of times, love the content, and I'm very excited to have you on the show today. So, hey, Bret, how are you?
Glad to be here, David. It's been too long. I don't know why we haven't done this earlier, but not to the lack of your trying. I am bad at follow-up, so I'm excited to finally do this.
Well, it's good that we get to spend a little bit of time together today and talk about Docker Compose and anything else that pops up as we go. So yeah, I'm really excited. I'll give you a little introduction, but to anyone that's watching that is not familiar, do you want to just follow up with who you are and a little bit more information, if you will?
Yes, sure. I've been in IT for almost 30 years, so I'm getting pretty old. I got the gray hair thing going on. And I like to say I was doing DevOps before it was called DevOps because we didn't know what to call it, right? It was just kind of optimizing and automating as many things as we could. Of course, that was the dark days of the 2000s when everything was hard to do. And about a year into Docker existing, I realized it was like the next wave of tech. I just was convinced that it was going to be everywhere and everyone was going to use it. And instead of being sort of an implementer of change, I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to influence it, and I love teaching. I love sharing with others. No matter what job or role I'm in an organization, I'm always trying to share information and learn from others and collaborate. So I did that, and then eventually I created a course. I got to be a Docker captain. They gave me that title because I wouldn't shut up about it, and I wouldn't stop bugging them. And then here we are today. I've got a team of people that help me manage over 250,000 people in 180 some countries on my courses. Thousands of people every month in there doing that, and it's fun, it's exciting. I also still do consulting, so I'm still a DevOps consultant because I like to do too many things all at once, and so I'm always learning. I'm always trying to learn new stuff, especially in the real world. I think like a lot of us, I teach what I know and I teach what I've done. So it's hard for me to just approach a topic purely for educational purposes. I really want to get my hands on and all that stuff. So I'm always like this year, if you see my live show, I won't shut up about things like GitHub Actions and GitOps and automation, essentially, of all things in the DevOps space, or even more into the ops space. But I come at this a little bit different too, because I'm an ops guy that lives in a developer world, and a lot of times my perspective is slightly skewed from developer tooling because I'm coming at it from that operator mindset. But it's great because I get to hang out with a lot of people that have different views than me, and that's always a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing all that. I'm going to throw a random question at you now, just since you early prediction of Docker being a game-changing technology. But let's remove Docker from the equation. Let's remove Kubernetes from the equation. What's that next big one? Is there anything you've got your eye on that you're playing with, or you think it's going to be really cool in the next 5 years?
Yeah, it's one. I don't know. It could be a lot of things. Like I have a hard time figuring out what would be as big, and it's not so much Docker the tool, right? Like to me, what I saw was that what I talk about is the three big innovations of containers. It was, and Docker kind of got them all right to begin with. The idea of the image format, right? So like those tarball layered, read-only sort of SHA-hashed objects that you can send around and easily transfer from machine to machine in a reproducible format. Like that was fantastic because we had NPM and gems and apt and get and all these other package managers and things, but they were always ecosystem focused. And so that was great. And then they made a really easy tool to run it. As we all know, the Docker command line. and then the registry to link them all together, right? So which is now becoming the generic object store, and we're storing Helm charts in there and all sorts of other manifests and objects and things, and it's becoming like that central hub of artifacts that you get throughout your organization. So I almost feel like it was a trifecta of great ideas that all landed at the perfect time. What the next one is, some people might say serverless. I feel like serverless is just a part of containers. And I don't think that the hardest thing for me with serverless is that it requires greenfield. So I don't think that that's really a wave of like it's going to hit us and then knock us on the floor and give us a big surprise like Docker did. Um, some of it I feel like might be the dawn of ARM computing everywhere, even though we've had ARM forever and there's a lot of people that are on that bandwagon, right? Alex Ellis is one of the big cloud native advocates of ARM. I feel like the fact that Apple has finally got in the game and doubled down by saying everything we do is going to be ARM starting next year.
Yep.
It's forcing Microsoft's hand, right? It's focusing every other laptop or consumer grade PC tech company to adjust to that new reality of thin and light, better battery life, longer lasting. But I think the real difference there is that it's going to make every developer a multi-platform developer. Like eventually we will all either be on a machine that's not the machine that our server platform is running, so we now have to develop on a different platform, or we're going to realize the benefits that if you've seen the AWS Graviton processors and some of these things coming out where indeed we're getting 40+% price to performance savings on servers simply by switching architecture. And so if that takes place first, then us as developers and operators will be on a platform that the server is a different platform than what we're on, because maybe we're still on an Intel machine. So the point there is that suddenly every developer that for the last 30 years hasn't really had to care, unless you're in an edge case or you're making embedded hardware or you're, which obviously there's lots of people that do that. But for the rest of us that are just normal lives as Intel people, we've never had to care. And I think that making developers educated about multi-platform is really, I think, going to provide a lot of long-term benefits for the ecosystem and allow us to do cross-platform things, give people choice and all that stuff. So it doesn't sound as exciting though, but it is to me, because I can nerd out on the hardware or the software all day long. So
awesome. There were a couple of things there. Like you mentioned, well, how old is Docker now, right? 7, 8 years?
8.
Yeah, 8 years.
We passed, did we pass 7 or pass 8? Shoot, I can't remember. 2013.
Okay, so we've got a whole industry of developers with less than 8 years experience who maybe have just always known Docker as their deployment mechanism. And I've been doing this for 20 years. You said you've been Wild West period, like you said, of the early 2000s, where deployment was that was weird. I am running a beta version of eCam, as we're about to find out today. However, there's that whole Wild West period where, I won't put words in your mouth, but deployment for me in 2002, 2003 was tearing up a bunch of files or doing a git pull on a production server and doing the build process on the production server under a directory that was called .live, moving the old one to .back, and then there was .back with a date timestamp. There's just so many people that have never dealt with that. So I think Docker, you're right. It's just perfect timing. And those 3 different tranches, there's 3 different problems that it solved. I think we're just perfect together. In fact, Docker always summarizes as what? Build, ship, and run. Like those are the 3 things that they try to do really well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Kubernetes is obviously taking a lot of the oxygen out of the room, and it's always neat and exciting to play with new tech on it. But I feel like it's building on the shoulders of giants, right? And those 3 original features, I think, are still today. Like I'm actually redoing some of the stuff in my Docker Mastery course, and I'm sort of doubling down on those 3 pillars of image, registry, runtime. And like, if you understand those 3 pillars, then you can kind of, regardless of whether you're using Docker or Kubernetes or Podman or whatever, right? You can sort of piece together the workflow of I got to build it, I got to get it places, and then I got to run it. And I've kind of shaped a lot of my storytelling around those things, because they really haven't changed, right? We've standardized, which is great. We've got formats now that everybody's agreeing on, and all the tools can center around it. And so sometimes I think, like, what's the next thing that will be so universal and it will be so loved that it will become a standard? that everyone will adopt in the industry? And I don't know, man. Like that's I don't really have a good answer for that one yet.
All right, no worries. Well, why don't we go back to something else that you said, and then we'll get hands-on with this Docker Compose malarkey stuff, right? You mentioned that, multi-architectures, the machine that you develop against may not be the machine that you're deploying to. I think with the advent of Kubernetes and microservices, distributed systems, that's what we're seeing is that people rarely are developing locally, at least maybe not on a full application level anyway. Which kind of ties in nicely to what we're talking about today with Docker Compose. So we posed this as that, should we still be using Docker Compose for local development? Is there a one-word answer there that you want to throw out, or are we going to do this through example?
Well, I mean, if you've watched any of my stuff or taken any of my courses, you will know that I'm probably going to say yes, because I'm a big believer in like streamlining workflow, minimalism. I am a fan of trying to create server-like infrastructure locally, but to a point. Like Kelsey Hightower is famous for, like, at least in my mind, he's famous for saying, I don't run Docker locally. I just build Go apps and then they get put into containers for servers, right? I think he might have said that on my show one time. And I took that to heart because as your team gets more efficient and you move to more modern languages and tooling, you may have less need for containers locally. And then what I see is the opposite happening some places, where people are going all in on Kubernetes and making that their local development environment or a remote development environment. Because if you've ever tried to run it locally, you know that it will burn down your CPUs and your lap if you sit your laptop on your lap with steady 3 to 5% CPU usage, even on keys K3s. There is just a natural loop that's happening in the background that's going to eat up cycles. So, and the reality is, Kubernetes was never designed to run for a developer laptop. That was not original scope of the project at all. But a lot of people are making it work there. And so I always say, well, to have to know Kubernetes to simply develop in a container is a lot, right?
Yep.
And I'm always working. I spend a lot of time working with new people because of my courses. So I'm working with people that are still relatively new to containers, adopting containers and Kubernetes. And so I very much sympathize with the minimalist approach to just get me the containers I need, just spin them up with a one-line command, and don't make me start a bunch of other things and have to know 5 different other tools before I can even start committing code, right? So Compose can do that. Other tools, not so much. And Compose is kind of universal. I think Docker brags about 800,000 YAML files on GitHub for Docker Compose. So they use that as sort of a bragging rights of, there's lots of Compose files out there. A lot of people are using it.
Yeah.
So, that's just spoiler alert. We're going to talk about Compose as a dev tool. We can talk about comparing it to others, although I'm not an expert on all of them, because there's tons of ideas out there for how to create a container-based development environment.
Oh yeah, definitely. And maybe
you might have demoed some on your show here.
Yeah, I think I could maybe contrast some things as we go if we feel it's pertinent. But we do have an interesting comment in the chat from Suji there. If you ask Bret, Swarm or Kubernetes, he will say Swarm. Are you still back in Swarm?
No. Well, CJ's teasing me. Yeah. Hello, CJ. I mean, I was one of the last holdouts for Swarm. I'm not saying it's a bad tool. And I still use it. Actually, I still use it to run some APIs on the internet for Slack integrations and stuff like that, because I can, it works with anything. I don't have to rewrite stuff into a serverless function or something, and I can just run some silly little web API on a DigitalOcean server. Of course, now we have all these, automated Kubernetes systems that spin it up and tear it down and all that stuff. So I could technically do that, but I've had swarms there for 4 or 5 years and they just keep on running. But I mean, Swarm was just sort of the casualty of everyone wanted one tool instead of 2, which I'm a big fan of having more than one option. I love that Nomad as a project is still a thing, so that we get some different ideas in the ecosystem around running clusters of containers, and that Kubernetes isn't the only thing in existence. But I don't recommend Swarm to any business anymore. It's more for like hobby projects or, Docker's still building it. into the container run or into their runtime, and I keep asking, and they keep saying they're still going to ship it, but they don't have any developers currently working on it. So Mirantis, the company that Docker split into, basically Mirantis bought most of Docker's employees as well as their closed-sourced software. They did that a couple of years ago, and they still have a couple of people working on it and building. They're actually working on adding CSI support from Kubernetes for storage, because one of the weak links in Swarm is, and Docker in general, is the plugin support for other volumes besides local volumes. And they're looking to just sort of adopt the CSI pattern so that people can write very similar wrappers or something around the existing CSI drivers for Kubernetes, and then they'll just work in Docker and Swarm. But we're still waiting on that PR to drop. They're working on a bunch of them, actually. But.
Yeah. I was actually Team Swarm as well, and I got dragged away kicking and screaming, just as the industry kind of selected Kubernetes against my will as well, however.
Yeah. Well, as an ops guy, I'm an ops guy who always wants things to be simpler. And the thing about Swarm that really spoke to me was like, man, if things could be this simple, how more productive would we all be? Like, how amazing could it be to have developers actually do more, like have more insight and be able to do things without feeling so handicapped around infrastructure and being, cut out of the infrastructure game, right? Because a lot of times there's a saying that I learned years ago called the ops mafia or the IT mafia, which is to say that traditional IT and ops tends to be a barrier for developers to get their stuff onto servers and into production. And until you get to a really well-oiled DevOps machine, that still tends to be the case in a lot of organizations. And I'm a part of that problem. I'm a part of those people that put in security requirements and all these infrastructure requirements of you have to write all this YAML and do all these things and do all these scans and all this stuff. And it was kind of like, man, if Docker could iterate enough on this idea, they might have a tool that could be presented and let people just get their job done, right? And the rest of it all gets handled for them. And there's actually still an idea out there, not that we're going to go down these rabbit holes. It's going to happen. But there is this idea that Docker's sort of riffing on for if you build, we'll get into this with Docker with Compose v2, but you can build Compose v2 today and have it deploy to a Kubernetes cluster using the Compose YAML. And so what if the idea eventually was the developer writes Compose YAML, and then the ops layers on their manifests or their Helm charts or whatever they need for the ops focused stuff. And there's just enough of an overlap that you're not forcing developers to write, Helm charts and customize, but they can stick with YAML simple it's all YAML, but simple YAML in the Compose format with maybe a little bit of extras for things like ingress. So there's an idea floating around about how Compose could be that bridge. Because if you go back to the original Kubernetes goals of the project and the founders, a lot of them talk about how they never intended for the manifest YAML to be the interface for developers to deploy applications. They were always expecting something else, and that else has been attempted 100 times, at least 100 times, in different projects, like we see with Customize and Helm, and there's just a ton of other ways to do it, where you're describing your application and all the parts of it in a way that Kubernetes can understand and deploy.
There's a whole SIG working on that and have been working on it for years now. So it's a difficult spec for them for anyone to write, really.
Yeah, and you have to get you have to take a lot of considerations into account, and then you have to get buy-in from the community, right? So you have to get enough people on board that it looks like this could be a winner, right? That's kind of like with Helm, right? Helm isn't always the right tool, but it looks like the winner. So we all gravitate to that first, even though it maybe isn't the right tool for every job or the easiest tool for every job. And I'm kind of holding out for Compose. So if I take my Swarm fan base, if I take my Swarm fandom and I apply it to just the Compose format and the Compose workflow, there might be a day where you can do a Docker Compose deploy, and it applies to a Kubernetes cluster, layers on some other things, and the developer and the operator can still exist and not step on each other's toes, but not have to know everything about everyone else's job, which is kind of one of the things that DevOps brought to the forefront, but also that one of the biggest stumbling blocks I find with teams, right, is that they now have to learn everyone else's stuff. Like, can I just focus on the things that I need to know instead of everything else? That's a real big challenge, I think, for companies, which is why us Kubernetes trainers are always training people on Kubernetes, because now all of a sudden they have to know it just to deploy their container app when they previously didn't have to know it.
Yeah. I do Kubernetes workshop at conferences, at least before COVID anyway. And I'm always surprised that the workshop just keep getting busier and busier all the time. There's always that influx of new people trying to learn the basics of Kubernetes and even containers and Docker. Like, it's just, and it's such a difficult space to do education in. So people should definitely check out your courses. We got a question there that I think correlates quite nicely to what you were just talking about there with compose files and applying them to Kubernetes. But Yanis asks, compose versus Docker stack for local dev. Now, Docker stack attempted to do that deployment of a compose to a Kubernetes cluster, or am I mistaken?
Yeah, Docker stack was like the production version of compose. So that's back. That's a great question. Let's back up a second. So what we're talking about are two potentially different things. There's the compose file format, which both Docker Swarm, aka Docker Stacks, and Docker Compose, the command line tool, those both share that compose spec. But there's two different tools there, right? There's two different purposes. So Docker Compose, the command line, which we're talking about today, that is optimized for local development workflow. And so whenever I teach developers, whenever I train consulting clients that I'm working with, it's always about let's get everyone all in on the Docker Compose command line as their developer tool, because most of these people that are coming into containers are not like, I don't advise learning Kubernetes as the first thing you're doing in containers, right? So I usually start them with Docker, and we get the typical onboarding is getting their Docker files and whatnot, and then once they can get the parts of that working in Docker, we say, okay, now let's do Docker Compose to describe your application and all the things about it in a very relatively simple YAML file. And then when they realize they can do a Docker Compose up and a Docker Compose down, and that spins up entire environments based on the directory it's in, they kind of get that light bulb. You can see it switch on in their head, and they like, okay, this is way easier than what I was doing before. And a lot of people even will avoid Compose or just not realize the power of it, and they'll write shell scripts around Docker commands. Well, that's the entire point of Docker Compose, is to avoid that. That's its whole purpose is to allow you to avoid shell scripts and other developer tooling and just focus on writing a few YAML files that describe your app that really I look at as almost like a predecessor to describing it in manifests, which are much more verbose and complicated. So in the long answer to that question, great question, by the way, thank you, is a stack is exclusively for Swarm, and Swarm is not a developer tool. So some of the things that you can do with Docker Compose, like Docker Compose PS and like some of these other command lines that we'll get into, you can't really do that easily in Swarm, and it takes more work. And Swarm really concerns itself with like uptime and availability and health checks and rolling updates and stuff like that, where Docker Compose, the command line tool, has none of that, right? Because it's really more about the developer experience. So we'll talk about how like Docker Compose has things like depends on that allows you to start things up in order, whereas Swarm and Kubernetes aren't really about that. That's like production infrastructure. You have to deal with that in a different manner. But local development, usually you don't want your web server bouncing for 5 minutes while your SQL server is ingesting content. So you want to optimize your local startup. You want to make it really simple with pretty colors and local commands and status commands and stuff like that. And that's really what the Docker Compose command line tool is all about. It just so happens that the two of them share the same file format.
So, I mean, we're going to get to the hands-on actually writing and working with Compose in just a minute, to anyone that's getting worried that we're now nearly 30 minutes in and we're still talking. But that's one of the reasons I still use Docker Compose format 2.3 or 2.4, because of the health check and being able to orchestrate the startup of the containers. But that was removed in subsequent versions. Is that now working again, out of curiosity?
Sorry, I was looking at the chat. Which feature?
Yeah, so in Docker Compose, I always used version 2.4, I think it is, because it allowed you to say, and depends on service healthy, service started, and actually orchestrate. Because when you spin something up in development, it's very different to the production environment where you are happy for things to flap while things are getting reconciled or whatever. But in development, like you said, I want to be able to start my SQL, Postgres, import, and then have my web application container start up because it's going to do some sort of seed or database reconciliation. And I do need that ability. But I believe they removed the dependencies in later versions were just start this container first and that's it because of something with version 3. So.
Yeah. And I'm going to answer that's a great question. I'm going to answer yours and Rajalian's question on does Compose v3 support limits like inprocs? So again, when we're talking about Docker Compose, the command line tool, not Swarm, we no longer have compose file versions. So the spec, which I'm actually going to put URLs in chat. So there is now a compose spec, and it's on a single markdown document. Not sure if it'll let me post URLs. Oh, yeah, okay.
It should be all right.
And so if you just go to like github.com/compose-spec/compose-spec, there's a spec in there. And what Docker did a couple years ago was they announced that basically they made the specification, we can call it an API spec, but the specification for how you use Compose. Again, Compose is too many different things to many different people. But when it comes to this API spec, they formalized, which we never really had that before. The Compose file version that we all typed version:2 and version:3, whatever, that was an implementation of the spec that they had never really formalized. So they formalized the spec, and then they said, okay, now it's going to be up to the tool to implement whatever features of the spec that they want, but we're not going to version the spec. So how this works is, we're going to talk today about Compose v2, and Compose v2 is really a rewrite of the whole Compose command line tool into Golang away from Python. They're integrating it as a Docker plugin right into the Docker tool. Lots of advantages. But one of the big things about it is that both that and the now legacy tool, which is Docker-Compose, now all follow in their latest versions the Compose spec, which means no more versions. So you don't have to worry about version 2.4. Other people don't have to worry about version 3 versus version 2. Like, none of that matters. The Compose spec is a superset of all of that, and it includes all those features and then new ones. And so it's now up to the tool to look at the YAML and decide how it's going to implement all the features, and whether it supports the deploy feature or the depends on feature or the health check feature. That's going to now be up to the tool. You could say that Swarm is a tool implementation. Docker Compose command line tools is a Compose spec implementation. And there's lots of other ones like Compose with a K, which is a Kubernetes tool for turning your Compose with a C YAML into Kubernetes manifests. That tool is also an implementation. AWS has an implementation for ECS. Like, there's a bunch of implementations now of this spec. And what's important for us is, in today's context, is that the new version 2 of the Docker command line Compose tool implements almost brand new spec. And you and I don't have to ever worry about those versions anymore. Now, Swarm, just to follow up for those people that were talking about Swarm doesn't yet implement this new Compose spec. So it still requires you to put in like version 3.8 or whatever, I think 3.8 or 3.9 is the newest version there. And if we went down the history road for a minute, version 2 was always kind of meant for local Docker Compose command line use, and version 3 was always meant for Swarm. And they never really fully fleshed out adding all the version 2 features to version 3. It wasn't like they didn't deprecate anything, which was a rumor on the internet. They just we weren't really ever sure how to implement depends on in a cluster. So they never really finished adopting the organization that's required in order to do depends on across many servers, right? They never really implemented that in Swarm. And so that was really the reason version 3 never adopted. And I'm like you, I love the depends on feature. We can actually go through an example and talk about it because a lot of people don't know that it exists, and it's pretty awesome.
All right, awesome. All right, we'll just quickly cover some of the comments, and then we're going to go over to the screen share, and we're going to start playing with some of this new goodness. So said V3 still has health checks. Yes, but it depends on functionality. Doesn't support conditional start thingies, which I'm hoping we're going to play with today. APM asked, does Docker Compose work with Podman? Not really, but as Kevin has commented, there is a Podman Compose. Feel free to check out that project. I think it's on the containers, github.com/containers organization.
Yeah, that's a good. I'm glad for that because I had forgot what the answer was. I knew that there was a way to do it, but I could remember what it was with Podman.
Yeah.
And so I guess that would be we have to look at it, but I guess we could say that hopefully Podman Compose is implementing the Compose spec, so that way we will start getting because if we were to dive and nerd out in the Compose spec, there's actually a lot of interesting ideas and things that could be implemented in various tools in various ways to allow us to all use this simple YAML file format to do actually more of the things that we don't think Compose is for, right? Like ingress, well, more advanced things than ingress, but I was going to say storage, but storage is kind of already in there with the drivers concept. But that's what we really haven't seen a tool take to the next level yet is taking the Compose spec and turning it into a production ready, almost like manifest light, right? And there is that ECS integration, like CJ is mentioning, and they have some new stuff in there as well for Azure ACI as well as AWS's ECS. So you can either check out my channel or Docker's channel. People have shown about how you can use the Docker command line with this new Compose tool to not just deploy to Docker, but also to deploy to clouds like an ECS cluster or an ACI server inside of Azure. So Docker, a side comment on this is that a lot of people, when they think of Docker in the old ways and how to deploy it, we think of things like Docker Machine, other tools for setting up Docker on a server. And since Docker is now focused as a company, they're focused on developer tooling, they're not trying to create servers anymore. In fact, they're almost intentionally going away from being we do runtimes on your server, so build a bunch of servers and do our stuff, right? Their approach is now, hey, look, the clouds have all got their APIs for how they want to do container deployments, and they all have different interesting ideas on how to do that in various ways. So now what we're seeing with this new Docker Compose CLI tool is it's using the Compose spec to allow you to deploy directly to those ideas rather than, like, we mentioned Kubernetes directly to the Kubernetes API, and then to something like ECS, which is a different cloud API, and then something like Azure ACI, which is a different API. So now Docker is, you think about it, they're adding integrations to integrate with cloud APIs, not with their daemon, which is totally 180 from the first 5 years of Docker's life, 6 years of Docker's life. It was all about the Docker daemon is somewhere. You have the Docker command line or the Compose command line, and you're talking to that daemon on a TCP port. And now what they're really looking at this is, well, we have that, and that's great, but our future is really in integrations to clouds, and we're going to use Compose as the way to do that.
All right, awesome. I think we should get you. I think we get your screen shared and we start having some fun with this new Compose CLI v2.
Too much talking, not enough doing.
No, it's good conversation. I think it adds a lot of context and people can understand the history of these tools and where it's going. I'm always amazed. The original Docker Compose written in Python, I think, was maintained by one person for the last 2 or 3 years of its existence.
There's one or two main people in there, and
so seeing it written go with the spec just brings that whole new lease of life to it, which is really exciting.
Yeah, there was a conference in Berlin, a Docker conference called the Distributed. That they only did it one time. It was 2016, I think, 2016, in Berlin, called the Distributed Computing Conference, and it was right after. I don't think it was KubeCon. It might have just been like a Linux Foundation conference. Anyway, in Berlin, and so everybody was there, and it was a really interesting conference because a lot of the ideas that we're still seeing implemented today in distributed computing and in Docker were first there, like shared, distributed storage. A lot of it that's distributed storage that's connected to containers automatically. Like those are still things that are being fleshed out. But one of them was, we're going to rewrite Compose in Go, and then we're going to be able to share libraries from Docker and Compose to use the same underpinnings instead of 2 different languages and 2 different libraries. And it's sad that it took this many years to get there, 5 years later. But at least it's here, and it's an opportunity, because I think there's a lot of edge cases around the Python, like Most people don't realize Docker-Compose uses PyInstaller, so it adds 200 or 300 milliseconds to every command in terms of delay, unless you're installing it with pip, because it has to unpack the binary, run Python with the scripts, and then do this stuff. And then, of course, debugging when you get errors in Python is always interesting. Yeah, there's lots of good news here. In fact, let me share my browser first, because let's go over real quick for those that aren't savvy of even how to get this before I start demoing it. I don't think I can share. I don't think I can switch windows. I think I just have to stop and start. But if the good news is if you are on Docker desktop, you already have this. So this new version is Docker space compose instead of Docker-compose. So it's a plugin subcommand of Docker. And if you have Docker desktop, it comes with it. You already have it. So just start typing Docker space compose from now on, and all your original commands work. And then there's a bunch of new ones. But they have their own repo. So instead of the old repo was github.com/docker/compose. The new one is, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so it's easier to read. The new one is compose CLI. So compose-CLI. And if you scroll down, you can find, for Linux people there, or people that aren't using, maybe they're using a VM and they're not using Docker desktop, you can get install instructions there, which is essentially, the newer instructions are essentially have Docker installed and download this plugin. And there's a format for Docker plugins, and they go in a subdirectory of your user directory and all that stuff. So they get you set up and running, and then you should be able to go to your command line and do that. By the way, I think did I link the spec? I think I already linked the spec earlier, but this is the spec, which is this very, very long single markdown file. I'll put the compose CLI there in the chat for people. But let's switch over and, man, the share. This is for later feedback on Ecamm Live. The sharing screen button is right next to the hang up button. It's super precise.
Well, I thank
Maybe
you
the
for
hang
not
up
hanging
button
up
should
on
be
me.
smooth,
So.
right? That would be awkward. Okay, and that concludes today's episode. So you'll notice that when I do a Docker-compose version, so this is my old Python runtime. And so you'll see like Docker Py, which is technically the library that Compose is wrapped around, and then CPython. And so now if I do a Docker Compose version, this is the Go binary that's running from a subdirectory of the plugins where all the Docker plugins are at. And if you do a Docker info, you can see in that info list, you can see plugins that are installed in your Docker. Some of us may not realize we've actually had plugins for a while. If you're running Docker Desktop will automatically add a scan. So Docker space scan which is from Sneak. So it's like a Sneak plugin. And then BuildX is the new advanced builder for fancier and faster building of your Docker images. So those are all plugins already. So now we get this new one, Compose, which they've been iterating through the release clients lately and still squashing some bugs and stuff like that. I tend to use it every day. I've been trying to do it all year. Obviously, as it's matured, the bugs have been less and less, and I think I'm only tracking like one bug that only happens every so often. So then when we do those Docker Compose commands, if you're someone who's used Compose before, if you just type Docker space Compose, you see all the typical commands, right? And most people actually, when they use Compose, they use like we all know like the Docker Compose up and the Docker Compose down. Those are probably the first two that everyone learns. Then they might learn Docker Compose build, which builds all the images that are inside of that one Compose file, which is convenient. But when you think of Compose, think of it as I should never have to type an actual Docker command without the Compose. Because the Compose is designed for a project mindset. So all of these commands have the scope of whatever current Compose YAML file you're using. So if I do a Docker Compose PS, I will only see listed the containers that are in my current project, not maybe other containers that I got running somewhere else on my machine, my local machine, my server, whatever. So that's one of the reasons I say like it's the developer friendly tool, because a lot of us may need to run multiple projects at the same time if we're trying to integrate two things together, or maybe we don't want to spin something down while we go test something else. And so these compose commands are designed to wrap the Docker and sort of filter out anything else in Docker that you're not dealing with at the moment in your current directory. And so a lot of people will be surprised to find things like Docker compose top, Docker compose. Now we've had PS, but now we have this new one, LS, which actually gets us, if you have many projects or many directories where you've done Docker compose up, you can now see a list of all those. And so because sometimes we forget, like we close some windows, we forget, oh man, I got Docker compose running somewhere. I don't remember which directory it's from. And it's not super obvious how to get back to them. But now in any directory, you can just type Docker compose ls, and it will just show you if you have any compose projects running anywhere on your system. I don't.
Yeah. What typically would happen to me is I'd run a Docker compose up and it would complain about the port bindings, and I'd go, oh, I've left something running somewhere.
Exactly. And that's exactly when you would use a Docker compose ls. I do that all the time as well. If you have a Docker desktop GUI, the GUI now actually has a lot of this built in too. I'm not going to show it, but the dashboard GUI now has it's compose aware. So it will show you a compose project and allow you to see the logs. You can start and stop it all from inside the GUI in case you're more of a GUI person. But yeah, so that's a really nice, they added that right up front when they started working on the V2, and that was a nice add-in because it was one of those things where you hit it and you're like, well, how do I deal with this problem? I do a Docker PS and I see a whole bunch of containers, but I don't know where they are or how to stop. I don't want to have to manually stop each one of them, especially if you're like a microservice person. That would be a lot of pain. So we have all the other typicals, like you can actually copy files in and out of your Docker Compose services, because remember, all these things are services in Compose. You can copy things in and out. You can exec into these, and you don't have to know the container name. So what I see, one of the big mistakes I see people using is they'll create a Compose file, and I've done this before I learned how this worked, but they'll manually assign container name. So there's a YAML value that they'll put in their file that says container name, and they'll hard code the container names. And that tells me that they're still using the Docker command line. They're not using Compose for everything. Because if you're using Compose for everything, like exec, PS, logs, kill, start, stop, restart, like all these commands that are managing it, you're using the Compose commands for the service name, not the container name. Because again, you can have a service with multiple containers, which is why when you start up something in Docker Compose, you will see like Docker Compose, service name -1, and then -2 and -3 if you do multiple replicas. And so it can do that. But if you assign it a hard-coded container value, you can never spin up more than one replica. It's kind of like having a Kubernetes pod that's manually named, and then you try to spin up an exact named pod. It won't work in that same namespace. So that same thing is happening here.
One of my biggest pet peeves, I think every Docker tutorial and Compose tutorial on the internet has container name hard-coded, and there's never a single good reasoning. And I always say this to people at conferences as well. There's not one single good reason for naming a container. Like using container _name, just remove it immediately. It's never good. So.
I don't even have to ask why they do it, because I have a feeling that they're doing it because they don't realize typing and talking at the same time, by the way, is really hard. They don't realize that whatever the command they needed to use for that container name probably exists in the Docker Compose command line, and it's probably easier.
They're always writing a shell script to do something with that container, and there's no need. Like, you can work around it. So.
Right. Oh, I just realized I'm going to be using Vim today to make it easier for screen sharing, and my Vim is in bright mode. So we're in.
I do like the mode though with the flames on it. I'm not sure how you got that, but that is it.
Oh, this is not my skill set. This is Space Vim. So look up Space Vim, which is kind of like a Vim installer packager manager. And it does all this stuff for you. So like if I just do this, it will actually update 134 plugins that it manages, including my font, all of the stuff at the bottom.
Very cool. I like that.
Probably shouldn't have done that.
I guess it's a variation of the Space Max, which is like Emacs with Vim bindings, and now there's a Space Vim. So
yes, it's mostly it's got a large community. It's mostly managed by one person, but it's regularly updated. I've been using it for years. I used to use SPF 13, I think, and that kind of died a little bit on the vine. wasn't getting maintained.
I like
So
the comment.
I've been using
That was brave doing a live update. Yeah, updating your plugins live. What could go wrong, Bret? Come on.
Yeah, I do it all the time. No big deal.
Is it NeoVim or just Vim 8? Do you know?
Is it what?
Is it using NeoVim or is it using Vim 8?
It uses both. And so, sorry, for me, my a Vim command is just aliased to in Vim. So you can use either one, and it will plug into both. It installs into both by default. It uses your Vim RC and all that stuff. I also enable italics for local use because I love italicized comments and stuff.
Well,
so
there goes my productivity for the rest of the week as I explore switching IDE again. So thanks for that.
Yeah, right. Like you're not the first person to tell me that, and I'm going to give you all a URL for later so that we don't spend the episode on this because it is a rabbit hole, and I love talking about it.
Yeah, let's just forget compose. Let's just play with your Vim setup for the next 30 minutes.
Right. So I'm going to put in the chat bretfisher.com/shell. So all of the things that I use in my shell there, including italicized, true color fonts, all that stuff is in there. I'm actually going to not use the shell because I realized I love using VS Code, and I'm just going to do that for today. So what did we make? We made temp Rawkode. So I'm just going to share that. That way I don't have to switch back and forth between windows. This thing doesn't. I could share my whole screen, but I'm on a 4K. So not that I couldn't share the whole screen, but it would be very small for everyone. So let's just do my new favorite editor, VS Code. All right, so we're just going to create a compose file, and then we're going to run some things. Do we have any questions in the audience that we haven't addressed yet?
No, just a confirmation that Space Vim is SpaceMax inspired, and some love for the rounded corner power line prompt, which I think was looking pretty good. So.
Ooh, I could also demo off. What's going to happen during those demos? I'm demoing Copilot, GitHub Copilot, because it.
I am hooked on Copilot. Now I don't turn it off anymore. It's just so it reads my mind.
Yeah,
it's unbelievable.
It's a little weird. Sometimes. I had a friend on the show, Nirmal Mehta, and we kind of tried to beat it up for DevOps purposes. And so we just spent an hour. I recorded like a week's worth of using it and recorded a bunch of little weird oddities, like using it for Markdown editing. It just starts writing words for you based on your previous words, and you can fill out a whole Markdown file in gibberish that doesn't really make any sense. It'll actually auto-create links for you that don't work to things that don't exist. I don't. Yeah, it's a little Wild Wild West right now, but
can you drag your VS Code window a bit wider? You're breaking my layout, Bret. Come on.
Oh man, it's always hard to figure out the right layout.
There we go.
There we go. A little bit more.
Yeah, you can go more. Yeah, there we go.
Ooh,
I think that looks good. Yeah.
See how? Yeah, it's already telling me wrong thing. It doesn't know compose files.
All right, so we got a comment from Paul saying that Bret is posting links, but they aren't appearing. Yeah, I'll just go check that now. They might be held for review because they are links, and I can fix that.
Yeah.
Let me go check that.
You make me like a commenter or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it auto works. If you have all the chat stuff, the security stuff enabled like I do. I'm not going to do Node. I'm going to do Nginx. So we're all familiar with this standard format and like stuff like that. And then my terminal. So there is a Docker tool that you can get for VS Code. I don't even have it showing up here, but you can get a Docker plugin, which I highly recommend. And you can see things in here and do things like, and you can actually run compose commands from the command palette. But I'm just going to use command line because I think a lot of people, that's what they're used to experiencing, and they do that. So if I'm in this directory, then I do a docker compose ps. But right away, you'll notice that this new one uses the new builder, which the new builder can do things much more concurrently. And it's actually really smart. There's a ton of advantages to it. But one of the things it'll do is if you're using multi-stage images, it won't build stages that you don't need for your current target in case you're someone who's in the multi-stage building. So that's a nice thing, is the new Docker Compose will just use the new build kit by default. And so I did that, Docker Compose PS now. And you'll see that, I'm going to hide the files. We'll see that we've got two services running, right? So this is kind of just sort of proof that, by the way, it's proof that it works like the old one works. And I can also just type in Docker Compose with a dash and get the same. You can kind of compare the old and new formats. So one of the things they've done with the new command is they've sort of refreshed the format. It now, they're fixing some of the old quirks since they kind of had to rewrite everything. So we'll see that. And then I can do things like Docker. Most people don't realize you can do Docker Compose top, Nginx, and that will show me the processes running inside of that particular service. So I can do that without even having to go inside it. I can pause things, stop things. So like the workflow that most people, if they're not familiar with it, you do Docker Compose up to start everything up. You do the Docker Compose down at the end of your day to stop it all, except for deleting volumes. And then you can do things like Docker Compose pause while you go to lunch, and it'll let your CPUs calm down because it'll just sort of freeze the CPU, but won't stop the containers. You can also do stop, start, restart. So those are all the common commands. But I think the value of a particular demo that we want to talk about, because we talked about the depends on and how that works, is to talk about two things, really. Two major things that most people don't know about that would probably help their workflow in Compose. And that's one, talking about your depends on example. And the other one is talking about profiles. And profiles, for those of us that are getting real world Compose files that are getting very large, maybe we have dozens of services in there, or just a dozen, or even just 5, you may not want to spin those all up at the same time. So profiles is a new feature in the Compose spec that the new Docker Compose tool now implements, that allows you to add a service line, and you can basically tag your services and then bring them up and down in groups based on this tag, which allows you to do things like maybe you have a startup script that seeds your database and does a bunch of things, and you only want to run that once. Well, you can now do that by specifying a separate service, and you can run it as a one-off, but it'll use all the Compose stuff. So it won't always run it unless you specifically run that profile. Other things you can do is, maybe if you're a developer on a larger team, maybe you're the front end developer, but the Compose file is written for everyone. So it has the API backend, it has the database, it has the worker jobs, but you're really just the front end person, and maybe you're using React, and you really only need you don't need the worker or all this other stuff in the background. You really just need the API and the database. So you can now use profiles so that you don't have to sit there and manipulate each individual service, like just doing the Docker Compose up of a specific service. You can now specify a group of services by tagging them.
That's awesome.
So that's really cool.
I've lost track of how many makefiles I've had to write that spins up just the right amount of services for what I was doing, or even to spin up a service which normally has replicate 0, but you're just trying to run a single command, like the database migrations and stuff. So
yeah,
that's nice. I like the profiles.
And that's the thing, right? And Docker's still trying to iterate on this stuff. So they've got some ideas around how to even take this further for one-off tasks. I think really one of the things that interrupts developer workflow is that we're all getting to the point where we're all starting to have common tooling, right? So we're all starting to learn Docker. We all know some basics of Docker Compose. Maybe some of us are saying that basic kube control commands are there, but then every team seems to have these shell scripts and make files and other utilities that are part of their workflow for local use. And I'm just going to say watch this space, because I think Docker is trying to figure this out a little bit better, using this new Compose syntax, maybe adding some more features in the future. But I have another repo that I'm going to use. I'm going to steal some examples so that we don't have to manually watch me type all this. Which, I'm sure that's super exciting for everyone. So I'm going to throw in something like this. Let's pretend that these servers, which they don't really, but let's pretend that these servers depend on a database. Because obviously these are just standard Nginx servers.
Yep.
But the Postgres server, if I throw it in and I just launch it, it actually, now I think about it, this won't actually work because it needs a password nowadays. So my example's already out of date. But one of the things that you want to do in these files now, and I'm gonna not bury the lead, and we're just gonna add the depends on.
You can also just add the environment variable for the password if you wish as well. I think it's just Postgres underscore password or Postgres underscore root underscore password to get it to start healthily.
Look at that.
In fact,
yeah. That's GitHub Copilot in action right there. All right, so let's assume that actually works. So up here, so there's two parts to this puzzle, and what we're trying to solve is what you mentioned earlier. Is I don't want my front end app to constantly bounce every time I do a Docker Compose up because it's waiting on the database to start. Well, in Compose v2, like you were saying, sorry, not Compose v2. That's not Compose command line v2, but in the Compose file version. Back in the day, we would type version 2.4, right? And that would only work with the local Docker command line tool, would not work with Swarm, which is fine. But it would allow us to use this depends on, but most people didn't know about this. Yeah. They didn't realize that they could extend the depends on to not just say depends on DB, because most people would do this. They would not have this line, right? They would not have that line. They would just have the depends on DB. And then they would realize that it doesn't really wait for the database to be ready. It just starts the database first so that the DNS is available.
Yep.
And so then the app would still crash because it's still waiting on the database to start or whatever. But there, in like 2.2 or something, they added this feature years ago that there's two different conditions here. You can say condition start or condition service healthy. And what we want is service healthy, which will use the Docker health check. And then we add the health check. So that's what I've done down here. And if you go looking for Docker, if you just Google GitHub Docker library health check, those 4 words, someone will probably find it and put it in chat. Docker has a library of sample health checks for almost all the common open source database technologies. So Redis, Postgres, MySQL. I'm not sure if Elasticsearch is in there, but they have other stuff, MemQ, something like that. And they will give you this example of how to add a health check to a container really easy so that you don't have to make a custom image or anything like that, because you don't want to have to do that. And then what happens is now when this starts up, and by the way, that's here. So if I do that and I go back, Docker Compose up. Oh, right, I took the version out. So we don't want that version anymore because now we're on Compose spec. So basically, if you've been around 5 years, you know that the version 1 of the spec that we all were using way back in the very early days of Compose, before we was even called Compose, there was no version for that. But now the tooling, if there is no version listed here, assumes you're using the latest version of Compose spec, not the old V1 from like 2015. So yes. that like most people probably wouldn't even think about that, but it's smart enough to know the difference. So if I do a Docker Compose up here, it now recognizes that it needs to load a database because I've set the depends on. I've just set up for everything, so it's going to start it all. But it's going to hopefully start that Postgres correctly, and then it's going to wait until the database.
Ta-da!
Yeah. So you notice that little pause there because I didn't do this on Nginx 1. I didn't give Nginx 1 a depends on, but I did for Nginx 2. And Some of these examples, by the way, I'm just going to put another link, are from a DockerCon 2019 talk I did. I'll put this in chat for everyone. So some of those examples are in there where I show off how to use depends on. Ignore the part of that video if you watch it about it needing version 2, because obviously in 2019 we still needed the version 2 file format, but now we don't. So ta-da, that's the demo of that one. Now I would do that on everything in a compose file. If I'm in a real team making a real app, I would have depends on everywhere, because what I would do is my front end developer, I would tell them, hey, when you do a Docker Compose up, you're probably going to want to use Docker Compose up of just your front end app. And so now it's going to be smart enough to find all the other services that that it's depending on, and it will start them first, wait for them to start, and then you can actually have multi-chain sort of startup order where the database then starts, then the API starts, then the front end starts. And so with me, I actually have another demo that uses most apps nowadays all require SSL. And when you're dealing with cores and other front end issues, you usually want to develop with SSL as well. So I have another repo, if you just go to my GitHub, that's called Compose TLS Dev Proxy or something like that. And it basically auto creates a self-signed certificate or even a Let's Encrypt signed certificate, uses traffic, and puts it all in your Docker Compose file so that you can have a boilerplate TLS wrapper around every one of your web apps without having to customize it for every web app. And one of the things you do with that in Compose is that you set it all in the depends on, so that essentially what you're saying is all my front end apps depend on the proxy to start first, as well as the database. And so now you get this wonderful startup order, and your front end team, your back end team, they can all just specify the one thing they want to work on when they do the Docker Compose up command. In this case, I'm just wanting to start Nginx. And the Compose is now intelligent and aware of how things are healthy or not. And you get this wonderful startup order. And then your team will love you, right? If you write this for your team and give this to them, if you now do a Docker Compose PS, you'll also notice that, they've all exited because I did a up FP. So now they're going to stay running in the background, detached. And as soon as that's done, if I do the PS again, you'll actually see healthy there. So we get this little extra information of maybe why things never started, because if your backend app doesn't start correctly, you're still sitting there waiting on the front end container to start. You're like, why doesn't this thing start? Well, eventually there'll be a timeout and it'll just not try anymore. But you can see this as a indicator for maybe why your depends on doesn't work.
Nice.
Any questions in the audience?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, just drop them into the comments and I'll relay them onto Bret as we kind of progress through this.
Yeah.
But it's nice just to see those conditions working. I used them heavily and would go to conferences and tell people never to use V3. It's only for Swarm and I hate it. It's awful. I don't like it. Use this one. And people kept moaning at me saying, don't tell us to use old versions or downgrade. And I'm like, it's not a downgrade. It's a different use case. Yeah. And I had this big, massive rant with so many people. And now it just works. And I've not followed the Compose spec. I haven't used the new Docker Subcommand plugin Compose. So I'm really, really happy to see that working. Awesome.
Yeah. I also love it when I have people on my show that teach me something. It's like I'm getting free training. So I sympathize with you. I know your joy, especially if it's a tool that you're already using and you're learning new stuff about it. Because one of the things I think that we're innately bad as humans at is we tend to, especially those of us that are just ravenous learners, right? We will learn something and we get to a point when we're learning that we tend to taper off our learning unless we have a new problem that we can't solve with it, right? Or a new thing. So we tend to, so a lot of things that I'm experiencing now with people when I do trainings is they have Docker and Compose knowledge, but they've not really kept up continually over the last 3 or 4 years. And they need a refresher, right? And that would almost be like a good course for someone to do is, Docker refresher or Kubernetes refresher. That's just the 2020 features, assuming that you knew it all from 2018 and 2019, just the latest features of 2020 and 2021. Because I think we're innate, most of us are innate, at least I am, really bad at going back to a tool, learning new things, figuring out what things in my files are now out of date and wrong. Also, shout out to linters. Because those are the things that will help you know that your old stuff is old. Linters will often be updated to the newest spec. Anyway, so if we don't have any specific questions on this one, so use Compose v2 plus the Compose CLI plugin. So the Compose CLI plugin is Compose v2. Okay, so when we're referring to Compose v2, that exact word together, that is Docker's way of saying we're rebooting Compose into the Docker command line. And I know it's confusing because there is a Docker file version 2 and version file version 3. We're not talking about that when we say now Compose v2. Docker has chose to brand for whatever reason. Naming is hard. Naming is like the hardest thing. They've branded this new reboot of Compose into the Golang and inside to the Docker plugin. They're basically saying this is now Compose v2 because they're rewriting it from scratch. I would have preferred them to avoid all confusion and just call it Compose v4 or something. And one of the reasons they said this, and it does make sense, because if you look at the Docker old command line, if you understand the difference between the file format and the command line, the old Docker-Compose version was perpetual version 1. It's not, the latest version is 1.29. So when they release this new version, it will, because it's still kind of in release client, it is now going to be the command line client version 2. What I'm saying, in all your files, all your YAML files now need to just remove their version format forever. The version YAML file thing up at the top can just be blank forever. No version needed. And what that means is that all the clients, except Swarm, because it's still not been updated. We don't know when that's going to get updated, if ever. All clients, all things that consume the Compose file, those are the things that are now responsible for adopting whatever feature you want, like depends on. Okay. Sorry for the confusion. I know it's a little much on those two things. All right, let's jump to our next demo, and we can come back to the questions real quick.
Sure.
So the next thing I want to talk about is let's find something else here. What if we started? Oh, sorry. Ghost. Maybe I have. Oh, Ghost Blog. I love Ghost Blog. I use Ghost Blog forever, ever since they first launched way long ago. It's a nonprofit. I'm a big fan of it. So not that WordPress is bad, but I love Ghost. It's also written in Node.js. So I use Ghost so that you can just start up a Ghost server. I think this is actually all I need. I'm not super positive. But let's say that your company has a single Compose file, and you really have them for the front end developers that are managing the website, right? Maybe they have the website and then they have the blog. So there's a couple of people that focus on the blog infrastructure, but they also need, but because maybe it's proxied on a subdirectory of the main website or whatever, you maybe need to have them all in the same Compose file, but you don't always need them all at the same time, because maybe there's the React front end people making the fancy website, and then there's the Ghost people just making the blog or whatever. So I'm creating a fictitious scenario for why we need this. So if we go, I'm sure that there is a web browser plugin for VS Code, because there's a plugin for everything.
There is a web browser extension.
Do you use one? Do you recommend one?
I don't use one, but I read like one of those listicles just yesterday about these top 10 VS Code extensions. And one of them was just bring your web browser in instead of switching to Chrome for debugging. Because I think VS Code, the debugging support in the IDE now supports the extension that gives you the browser. So you don't have to speak to like a real Chrome or anything. Yeah. It seemed cool. Let's see if I still got it in my history.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm distracted on this, but oh wow, that's deprecated. Dev tools for Chrome. Yeah. Someone in chat knows a good one that they
There's
recommend.
one called Browser Tab. No, it's not got many installs though.
Go wrong. Browser Tab.
Oh, Browser Preview. That's the popular one. Yeah, I found the listicle.
Real browser preview. Yeah, that's a browser preview though. Anyway, I'm not sure if that's going to work, but because I don't want a preview of the YAML file. I just wanted a browser tab, so we don't have to switch. Anyway,
it's a browser tab. You get a URL bar and everything.
Oh, okay. I'll try that.
What's the worst that could happen?
I know, it's only going to have access. It's like, please log in with your GitHub account. Oh, now you have everything. Browser preview. All right.
Yeah, we got another vote for browser preview in the comments as well. So.
Oh, nice. I'm trying to think how do I want my window? I don't want it to be on the top there. So we probably only need the last command. All right. So what are we doing? We're doing we're going to go look at the compose spec real quick so that I can show. We can sort of correlate these things together. If I go to the spec, then can I do find in here? Will it do find inside the document? Probably not. Let me find the actual header. There we go. That's what I want. Profiles is a new feature in the spec. And so the spec is really just talking about how it should work. They give an example of maybe what it would look like in YAML. And so we have the service at the top. Sorry, the services, the main services, then the service, a single service, and then the profiles that it's going to be a part of. So by default, they're all technically sort of a part of the default profile, but you can add custom ones. And so that's what we're going to do for Ghost. And maybe we're going to say, for profiles, it only needs to be a part of the blog profile. And then everything else is a part of just the default. So if I do a Docker compose up, oops, no, I didn't want to do that. If I do a Docker compose up, notice that it still doesn't show. Well, let's just make sure I save the file. No, I don't want no tricks here. Okay. You'll notice that it didn't. It doesn't show that Ghost blog part. It's not considering it a part of the project because I didn't specify that profile. So if you look at the Docker compose command line help, you'll now see this new option here. So, and it's easy to get confused for me, at least. I confuse the project and the profile. So we've always had project. Project is the current scope. And if you didn't know, when you type a Docker compose command, it looks in the current directory for a file called Docker compose YAML, and then it will look up a directory and so on until it finds one. And it considers that the project. You can override that. Obviously, you can have a different file name if you want, and you specify that with a file name. You can override which directory to use, and you can actually override the name of the project. The real quick reason on why you'd ever want to do that is if you've ever wanted to spin up two of the same thing in the same directory. That's how you can do it, is you can override the project name, and then it will spin up the same YAML file, but it will use different container names. It'll add basically the project name inside of the container name. That's why when we all probably didn't realize this, but when you do a Docker compose PS, you're actually seeing the project name first. That's what the Rawkode part is. So if I override that with a -p, it will replace that value with something else so that they don't conflict, right? Because we can't have container names that conflict. Now, caveat, if you're hard coding your ports, this will also not work because you'll get the port confliction. But the way you get around that in Docker files is you just don't specify your published port, and then it will randomly assign you ports that you can use every time, and then it'll make sure they never conflict. So that's a really cool way if you ever want to spin something up twice without having to clone it down twice and all that obnoxious stuff. All right, so anyway, back to profile. So profile allows another layer inside of the project. So I'm in the project scope. I'm now going to have that profile part. And so if I do a Docker compose profile blog up, it will spin up the Ghost.
Nice.
Now,
Very
this
cool.
profile, I have to specify it with every command in order to get the awareness of those things, right? So if I don't type in dash dash profile, then it won't know what ghost is because it won't. I think that's true for every command. Someone in chat might. I don't know if Sujay's still around, but somebody in chat might know that I'm wrong. But every command that I'm aware of expects that profile there. So now, notice when I do a Docker compose PS, actually no, it is listing ghosts. So see, I'm already wrong. What I was going to say was I have to use Docker compose dash dash profile log PS, but it's indeed listing it. So now that I think about it, that might have been a recent change where they added to the PS command, because I've been watching the commits, and they're these new commands that they're doing, especially this new feature, they kind of go back and forth based on feedback. So shout out to Docker taking community feedback, because if you can jump on their Slack or in their GitHub issues, and they really are taking feedback and adding new features to compose based on feedback. I've had several of my own features, including adding this healthy statement inside that line there, adding that into the new compose just because I put in a GitHub issue and they marked it for development and put it in. I didn't have to actually PR it for them. So we can do that same thing with something like Docker compose. Let's actually see if this works. Docker compose top ghost. Okay, so see that maybe they've now done it so that it knows when I did the up, I did it on a specific profile, so the other commands are semi-aware of it, because it didn't used to work this way. Docker compose exec ghost bash. Let me do that. Okay, so there you go. That's what I was looking for. Is it doesn't see the service ghost because I have to do this. It's a little tedious. There we go. And now I'm inside of my container. So I tend to use this for either teams that are all semi a part of each other's workflow, but they often don't need to start up everything. And but I often actually use this more for one-off. Maybe you want to install all the packages. Maybe you have a monolithic app and it's Ruby plus npm plus apt-get stuff, and you want to do a refresh of all the packages or whatever. And you don't want to have to shell in and then type each thing manually. So what I've seen teams do, and a team that I'm working with is doing this, they do write little shell scripts to automate all that, those common developer workflow commands for their environment. And then they just make that something inside of another service. So they might just make something called, one-off, or maybe update. Then they'll make it the profile update. And then let's say the image we're using is still ghost. And what they really need to do is they're wanting to apply change, assuming we got bind mounts here and we're all talking to the same database, they want to do maybe a database schema update, or they want to do something that's not necessarily in this container, but they don't want to shell in and have to type a bunch of commands. So then they can type here, command, whatever. That have to get install ghost. So yeah, maybe curl, right? So they could do this. Now, what that means is when they're in their project, when they just do a normal Docker compose up, it's never going to try to run that service, right? That service is by default will not run because it's not in the default profile. So that and default profile means basically everything that's not listed as a profile. And then when I want to do a one-off, one of the neat things about this feature is that it knows if I want to do a run command or an up command on something and I specify it directly, I don't have to list the profile name. So I can do something like Docker compose up, or just run, what I call it, update. So that was like a really short command, Docker compose run update. And essentially what I'm turning this into is a tool for utility commands that I don't want to have to remember the whole long command that I want to do, like a schema update or a, scan with sneak or trivy inside of my image and looking for all of my vulnerabilities. Maybe you don't want to have to remember all those commands. So now all you really need is an image. It doesn't really matter what image you use. It just needs to be the one you want to run the tool in.
Yep.
And then you can override with that command right there. And then this actually doesn't matter what profile you call it, because we're never going to specify that profile. In this case, we're only going to run that particular service by name when we want to do something. So you might have one that says schema update and another service here that says apt-get update or something. And it saves you keystrokes. And it honestly, what it will do for your dev team is create a standard around how they do these things. And you can even, because you can sort of make this command really ugly, you can avoid shell scripts here as long as you don't have too much complexity by just doing it in the YAML. And now your YAML becomes that single makefile universal automation tool for local dev.
Okay. So just to clarify, like the existence of the profile is key to move it from the default profile. Meaning if you run a Docker Compose up right now, we will not get an update. Is that correct?
Say that again.
If we run Docker Compose up, we shouldn't see the update container run.
Right.
Because the existence of the profile list means that it's removed from like any sort of default profile context. We also did get a comment from Suji in the chat saying that you can use compose_profiles environment variable. So.
Boom. He's always adding value to my streams.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Perfect.
man. You're my wingman. So that's a great point. You might even have some developer documentation that says, if you're on this team or if you're working on this, just set this profile value and then all things will be fine, right? You can, I'm assuming you can use .env for that, or, well, wait, .env goes into the compose file. It's not used by the compose CLI. I'm not sure if that's true. Anyway, compose can consume a .env file if you want to set environment variables there, so you don't have to remember every time in your shell to set it.
Yep.
But yeah, in fact, there's a whole web page on environment variables that the Docker Compose command line can accept, including the profile, the Docker engine to connect to, there's a lot of things you can do there. And yeah, compose profiles. Great tip.
Awesome. Yeah, those profiles are a long overdue feature that would just remove an entire class of makefiles that I've been adding to all my projects over the years. Like they can just disappear now because I can have profiles for one-off tasks and different sets of containers that I need for different purposes. Particularly CI is a really good one where I may want to run different sets of tests and use profiles to be able to kind of orchestrate them in a pretty clean way. So very cool.
And if someone's thinking about, well, when can I use this? Because RC, it's release client, right? So this new tool isn't truly GA. You can still do all of this with the old, maybe I may not be speaking out of turn, but if I do Docker-compose, because the old compose tool uses,
no profile.
Oh, there it is. It's not in alphabetical order. Because what I was getting ready to say is that the profile is a compose spec feature, not it's technically a CLI feature combined with a spec feature. So you could argue it either way. But what I was going to say is that I believe that the old compose traditional Docker-compose traditional tool, I believe that uses and supports this profile feature. And I think they've had that for over a year. If we go back in the releases of the compose everybody knows, they converted to they updated to the compose spec as their file format at least over a year ago. And so those of you that are not yet ready to either run a release client, or you maybe don't have Docker desktop and you don't want to use this release client tool yet because you're worried about bugs or whatever, I would say, the compose you have now, as long as it's up to date, supports a lot of these things. What it doesn't support is some of the new command line, like the ls command, right? Like the new. By the way, we can actually do that because now that we have a project, so you'll see that cool. it would list, and this is across my entire daemon, like I was saying. If you got 5 other directories where you're running stuff, you'll see all of them listed by their project name. If I were to do a Docker, since we didn't do any ports, this actually should work. If I do a Docker compose project, no. Project name. It's also dash P, but I like the name in there for everybody so they know what I'm doing. So I just spun up the whole same thing that we just did in a duplicate environment, but it's going, if I had ports assigned, it would conflict, but we don't have ports right now. So now I can do a Docker compose ls, and we can see both of those running.
Yeah, I think we need to open an issue against the compose CLI so that it lists the directory the compose file was in. Because that's just like 2 projects to me, and I'd have no idea where those lived.
Or like the either relative path or these maybe just the full path to the compose file that it used for that project, right? Yeah, because right, that's the problem right now is
where did Bret come from? Yeah,
yeah, because I customized it. Now let me just real quick off screen look at the Docker dashboard to see if it actually, because they've been taking a lot of feedback on the GUI as well, and those of us that have been trying to use it are saying, hey, we need this, we need that. So no, I don't see it showing me an indication of which compose file. So that's a great idea. I wouldn't be surprised if that was already in there. Or almost like Docker compose info, right? That does sort of a investigation. Oh, you know what? I wonder if convert lists it. Convert is a little bit of a new thing. No, it doesn't. Convert is a kind of a new command. Basically, what it does is it ingests whatever you're giving it and then spits out a consolidated YAML of what it's going to use. So, like, for example, I don't specify network in our YAML because I just use the default, but this is literal.
Yeah.
So this is kind of like what Docker dash compose config, I think, used to be. So if we did Docker dash compose config, one of the things that it would do is it would spit out, and you see how it automatically, in that old command line, it would spit out a version. It would assume version 3.9, the latest, because I didn't specify one. So it's a little bit like that old tool, but it also has other options that are interesting. So if you look at the help of it, it will help you list out things in a little bit different format. It's a little bit weird to use, but if you just bear with me for a second. Docker compose convert services will just list my services. Docker compose convert volumes, which I don't have any. So if I do profiles, so this might be a part of, not that we're trying to run bash scripts here, but if you wanted to wrap this in other commands, this is kind of one of those things where this would be handy to just spit out the information I need in order to form, in an automated way, other Docker compose commands. So maybe if you're using Docker compose in CI and you want to find all the services and then check them all or do something like that in an automated way, you could use these as automated responses in command lines. At least that's really the only reason I can think of using it that way. But
I wonder if the compose ls can't list the directories, because I mean there's no primitive of compose project, right? I mean maybe it's just parsing the names of the containers and going, you look like a compose project, and that's all it really knows.
Right, true, because a lot of this is dealing with labels, right? So if I think I have to do.
You might have to do a container inspect or something.
Yeah. A lot of people, there's not actually a lot of magic to compose, really. It's just really talking to the Docker command line, or Docker CLI, not to the CLI, but to the API of the Docker engine, and adding labels for all of the things it needs to do to keep track of. So you will see these.
Working there we go. Right.
Yeah. And so that is actually and I think I mentioned this earlier, but I want to reiterate, you can use both command lines back and forth. They're designed to be compatible with each other. So you can use a Docker compose up with the dashed old version and then a Docker compose down with the new version. So they're completely compatible with each other because they're really just using, for the most part, these same labels to identify the services and the volumes and the networks and all that stuff that it needs to know. So it's not like there's a database somewhere or some compose API that's running as a daemon, and there's no storage inside of Docker really to keep compose specific things. So it just uses the same labels like we would use in a Kubernetes cluster, really, to do that work. If you're a Swarm fan, Swarm actually uses for the stacks. That stack feature really only uses service labels to organize all the objects for stacks. So that's actually how Swarm works as well. It uses different labels. These are actually container labels. In Swarm, it uses different object labels for the stack to work. But anyway, it's all just metadata all the way down. All right, what else we got, people? Someone asked about security. That's a whole separate topic.
Yeah, well, you just asked if we covered any security practices here. I mean, does security come into play? I mean, we're still saying Compose is a tool for local development rather than production. So do we leave security at the other side of the door for that?
Yeah, because again, like you're saying, like, I don't advocate, even though you can technically use Compose on a server for production, I don't really advocate its use. I feel like in most cases, we've all moved beyond it. That being said, with the new Docker Compose deploy, which we didn't even talk about today, but maybe some other day. Have you had people on your show before to talk about the deploy, the ECS and ACI stuff?
No.
I know you've had some Docker people on recently, so I didn't know if you. Because Docker Compose. There's not a deploy, right? Yeah, no, they haven't changed it. All right, I haven't used this in a few months. So Docker Compose up, and I can point it at a ECS cluster or an ACI instance or other types of Docker plugin connections. I don't know how I should describe it.
Does that coupling of deployment with like your database and your app not give you the fear though? Like I can't see a world where I'd want to use that. I think that's where I get stuck.
Well, I think the argument the reason that Docker's adding all of these is that they feel like there's still a really big gap. And you'll see this with Docker Desktop with the new dev workspaces or dev, what are they called? I have to look it up already. Dev environments is what they're calling it, which different topic altogether. But what we're seeing is that Docker is trying to solve developer problems, not production problems, right? So I would argue that this Docker Compose up towards ECS or ACI, or I've been asking them to do a DigitalOcean one, and some of the other non-major clouds. I know that they would like to do a Google one as well. They argue that maybe this is really for the one-person shops, right, where you're just like the solo DevOps person, and you simply can't use those other tools because of their complexity, and you don't have enough time, and so this is good enough. And also, a lot of times developers need to share what they're working on, or just literally just test something on a server somewhere that's outside their machine. I actually was just working with a developer yesterday that he had a 2018 MacBook, and he couldn't spin up in Docker locally the environment that he needed to test the app, because it required 16 gig of RAM for everything to work and to run all the RSpecs, because there was like 90,000 RSpecs or something. So they needed a server to run it on, and there's not really any deep, easy integration in a lot of these tools to just say, hey, create me an instance on the cloud, put my stuff on it, run it there for a minute. And I think that's what they're doing. Now, will people use that for production? Sure. People always use dev tooling for production when they shouldn't. But I think there's room, right? There's room for us to have this tooling. What I do hope is that they communicate well about the goal and intent of these tools, not, hey, look, we have this new way to deploy the ECS. You should totally use this all day for production, right? Because they don't always, the messaging is sometimes lost in, hey, look at the new thing we did. Then people assume that you say, oh, well, you said ECS, so you must mean your production workflows.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it through that lens, but people, if you're using managed services from AWS and you just need to get your dev environment into that environment, then that's actually a really good way of doing it. And I just hadn't really given that a lot of thought. So maybe that would work. I mean, still a whole bunch of other concerns around the authorization and the IAM policies to speak to those managed services, but for a very crude development environment that's in the cloud, that would work.
I think for the same thing, like the same the same thing was happening with Docker Machine. People were using Docker Machine to spin up production servers, and I probably was quoted. You probably could have found a video of me from somewhere circa 2018 saying, "Hey, look," because I appeal to the solo DevOps, to the solo developer, right? Whenever I do a talk at a big conference, I always try to get one of the things I do survey is how many people here are responsible for their DevOps, and they're the only one that is doing that in the team. Essentially, what I call hashtag solo DevOps. A quarter of the room raises their hands, right? So there's this huge need that's not the majority, but an untapped need for we don't need at scale. In fact, if I were to put on a T-shirt from Pulp Fiction that says "Say at scale one more time," the famous line, I'm forgetting his name now, Samuel L. Jackson's character, he says, say something one more time, and to say at scale one more time on the internet, because there's definitely a lot of tools out there that are focused on large infrastructure, hundreds or thousands of containers, but there are definitely lots of teams where there's one person, maybe two, they need a dozen servers, maybe 20 servers, and they just don't need the inherent complexity that comes with implementing Terraform, Ansible, Argo CD, GitHub Actions, and this huge tech stack for I want to run some containers on servers for a while. So I appeal to those people. Yeah.
Okay.
What's up with that?
We've ran a little bit over, so I'm going to pop us back over to here. Sorry, do you have anything else you want to show?
No, that's it. I mean, we could talk forever, so we have to cut it off at some point.
Yeah. I'll leave you as the
really, I'm here to answer questions, so if people have more questions, yeah.
Yeah, we'll take one more question. If any more slip in, we'll do our best to answer them. But Walid asked, is it still in beta, the ECS thing? Because he says that he has to enable some sort of beta Docker thingy to get that to work. Is that the case?
I don't know if Sujay's still in chat. He might know more. I would say, as far as I know, it is still pre-general availability, pre-GA, pre-release. I am assuming that they're tying the version, because right now we're on like RC something of the actual Docker Compose command line tool, and that plugin is what's needed in order to deploy to these contexts. And we didn't get into context, but that's what we're talking about. You change your context from your local Docker engine to ECS or to ACI, and then you can use Docker Compose up to deploy to those contexts, similar to Kubernetes kube control context. And as I'm assuming that they're tying those features to the version of the Compose CLI, since they're bundled in with it. And since it is not GA, I will assume that they are also not GA. But that's a lot of assumptions. Don't quote me on that.
All right. Well, that was an awesome feature pad session. It was really good to get a look at that and just see how the profiles worked and see how the Compose CLI is coming along. I'm really excited with that, and I'm looking forward to actually, like I said, removing a whole bunch of make files and bash scripts. I have so many of them scattered across so many projects that one simple profile feature just removes all. That's really exciting to me.
I have the same way. In the same way, I was using something called Docker App, which is really not anymore a thing. They're deprecating that as well. But there was this idea for a while about formalizing a lot of the tooling and versioning around Compose files into something that was called Docker App. And one of the offshoots of that is that it could kind of dynamically create Compose files on the fly from other templates. And this profile thing basically saves me from all of that. It saves me from having to try to wrap around that. Another Docker captain was actually working on all of that stuff too, trying to formalize a tool that would allow us to basically solve the templating needs of complex teams that need to use Compose for development environments, but not always spin everything up all the time. And yeah, that profile feature definitely, I'm sure there's more things we could add to it, but I think that really helps. I should do a plug for you and me as well. For those of you that are in chat, if you didn't get your questions answered, we both have Discords. So, I'm in his Discord. I think he's in mine. I'm not sure. So just find us in Discord if you have questions later, or on Twitter. We're both on Twitter. If we don't get your questions answered, don't worry. We're not going anywhere. Because we live on the internet, so I'm available after this live show.
Yeah, we're both very active on Twitter. Our handles are on the screen. We both do have Discords. We're active there too. And in fact, we pulled through a lot of your announcements into our channel as well. So sharing the love and the knowledge as much as we can. So All right,
I
Brett.
need to have a zap for you. I need to have a zap for you. We need to figure that out later. So
Yeah.
I'd love to have that more of that stuff in some of my Twitter channels too. So we'll talk about that later. All right.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, for guiding us through this. It's just so much value in the conversation as well. You just shared so much insights there about how people are using this tool. Definitely go check out Brett's courses. Keep learning, and thank you again. Brett, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah. See you all. Bye.
Thank you for watching Rawkode Live.